St. Louis, and I thank you for this important hearing. The surveillance and criminalization of Muslims is older than this nation's founding. Many seem to forget that enslaved Black people were forcibly brought to this country, starting in 1619 from across the African continent, including regions that were predominantly Muslim, which meant that thousands of people who came to this country through the slave trade over 400 years ago were Muslim. Enslaved Black Muslims practiced their faith in secret out of fear of retaliation. They resisted slavery. They fought for our liberation, and many recorded their experiences in Arabic or other languages to avoid suspicion. The history of Black Muslims in this country is American history. And I sit here as a Congresswoman and lawmaker to say our history will not be erased. Our history, including the history of mass surveillance of Muslims, and that extends much further than September 11th to the targeting of Black nationalists in the 1920s, and then the Nation of Islam by the FBI's COINTELPRO. Surveillance, intimidation, and targeting based primarily on the perception that Black Muslim Americans in pursuit of Black liberation somehow pose a threat to society because of their religious and racial identity. Today, Black people make up 20% of our country's Muslim population and are facing surveillance and criminalization. In documentation that was recovered from the New York Police Department's mapping and surveillance of Muslims, American Black Muslims were included in the list of ancestries of interest. Ms. Suara, can you talk about the impact of post 9/11 policies on Black Muslims?
Thank you so much for that question. Black Muslims are facing attack two ways: prongs as Black, and they face all the discrimination and racism that comes with being Black in America, but also being Muslims. We have policies at the state level that marginalize Black Americans and Muslim Americans. A couple of state legislation in my state talks about indoctrination in schools, talks about no-go zones that are not existent. There's a report about driving while Black in my state that talks about how people that are Black or brown are targeted and profiled and stopped in different ways more than any other member of the community. And because of all of that, I think when I talk about this discriminatory policy, I always look at it from what it's doing to our children that are born here, that are citizens here, that see all these things being thrown against them, that see their government telling them that they do not belong or they do not have the same right. So a lot of policies, as a Black American, as a Muslim American, tells me that I do not belong, tells me that I do not belong in a space with my other colleagues, and that is very discriminatory. So a lot of them, there's a lot in my statement about examples of some of those policies that we've had at the national and at the state level.
Thank you for making that very clear for everyone. Thank you so much. Professor Alam, can you talk about the ways in which surveillance against Muslim communities is used to target other communities and protesters more generally?
Representative Bush, I'm not certain if you meant Professor Wadia or myself.
Yes, to you.
Thank you, Representative Bush. There are several connections to be made across surveillance of other communities. What we've seen is, when you mentioned starting with surveillance of Black Muslim groups in particular in the 20th century, the Moorish Science Temple and Nation of Islam, which were seen as foreign and suspect, and much of it has continued to this day. The same methods of policing and surveillance and using race, ethnicity, and national origin as a proxy, as the primary indicator for suspicion continues today. I've detailed some of that in my testimony. We detailed some of that in my written statement. But it's also happening, for instance, with Chinese nationals in this country. Chinese students, for instance, are being marked for suspicion. And that's something that we've worked on, and we've worked persistently to actually dismantle that entire system by which the federal government essentially uses its policing and surveillance powers to mark communities on the basis of their race or national origin and seeing them as suspects simply on those bases. That's happening across communities. That's happening with Asian American communities, Muslim American communities, and has been happening, of course, with Black communities in America for a very long time.
Thank you. Just really briefly, according to a 2019 study released by Muslim advocates, Muslims make up 9% of those incarcerated in state prisons, though they only make up 1% of the US population. Chairwoman, I ask for unanimous consent to introduce the Muslim advocate study mentioned above into the record. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection.